April 18, 1942. Dawn breaks over the western Pacific Ocean. The aircraft carrier USS Hornet pitches through heavy seas 650 miles east of Japan. On her flight deck, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, massive twin-engine aircraft never designed to operate from carriers, strain against their wheel chocks, engines roaring, propellers spinning. In the lead plane, Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle checks his instruments one final time. Behind him, 79 other airmen prepare for a mission that defies logic and precedent. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, America is reeling. The Pacific Fleet lies crippled in Hawaiian waters. Japanese forces have conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies with stunning speed. The rising sun flag flies over a vast empire stretching from the central Pacific to the borders of India. American morale has plummeted. The nation desperately needs a victory, any victory, to prove that Japan is not invincible. The mission planned for this morning is audacious to the point of madness. 16 Army Air Force bombers will launch from a Navy carrier, something never attempted before, fly 650 miles to Japan, bomb Tokyo and other cities in broad daylight, then continue another 1,200 miles to airfields in China. They cannot return to the carrier. The B-25s are too heavy to land on a carrier deck. If everything goes perfectly, they might reach China with enough fuel. If anything goes wrong, bad weather, stronger headwinds, early detection, the crews face capture, death, or ditching in the ocean. At 8:20 hours, a Japanese picket boat spots the American task force. The element of surprise is lost. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the operation, makes the fateful decision: launch immediately, 10 hours early and 200 miles farther from Japan than planned. Doolittle's plane rolls forward, gathering speed on the pitching deck. The B-25's wheels leave the carrier. Engines straining, the bomber clears the bow with feet to spare. One by one, the other 15 bombers follow, each successful takeoff a minor miracle. This is the story of the Doolittle Raid, a mission born of desperation, executed with courage, and remembered as one of the most daring operations in military history. It inflicted minimal physical damage, but delivered a psychological shock that reverberated through both nations. It proved Japan was vulnerable, boosted American morale at a critical moment, and set in motion events that would lead to one of the Pacific War's decisive battles. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, shattered American illusions of invulnerability. In 2 hours, Japanese carrier aircraft sank or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed over 2,400 Americans. The Pacific Fleet, America's primary deterrent in the Pacific, had been crippled. Japanese planners believed they had bought 6 months to a year to consolidate their conquests before America could strike back. The weeks following Pearl Harbor brought only more disasters. Wake Island fell after a heroic defense on December 23. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. The supposedly impregnable British fortress of Singapore capitulated on February 15, 1942, the worst defeat in British military history. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur retreated to the Bataan Peninsula, fighting a desperate delaying action. The Japanese advance seemed unstoppable. American military leadership faced a crisis. The Navy's battleship force was devastated. The remaining carriers were desperately needed to defend against further Japanese expansion. Offensive operations seemed impossible. Yet President Franklin Roosevelt and his military advisors understood the psychological imperative of striking back. America needed a victory, needed to prove that Japan could be reached and attacked, needed to demonstrate that the war was not lost. The idea emerged from multiple sources, but Captain Francis Lowe of Admiral Ernest King's staff is often credited with the initial concept. In January 1942, while watching carrier practice flights, Lowe realized that Army bombers, with their longer range, might be able to launch from a Navy carrier, bomb Japan, and fly onward to friendly airfields in China rather than attempting to return to the carrier. It was an unprecedented concept. Army bombers had never operated from carriers. The coordination between services would be complex, but it was possible. Admiral King approved preliminary planning. The concept went to Admiral Halsey, commander of the carrier task forces, and to Army Air Force General Henry Hap Arnold. They selected Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle to plan and lead the mission. Doolittle, at 45, was already a legendary figure in aviation, a pioneering pilot, engineer, and the first person to perform an outside loop. He had won the Schneider Trophy for seaplanes, earned a doctorate in aeronautics from MIT, and set numerous aviation records. If anyone could make this impossible mission work, it was Doolittle. Doolittle threw himself into planning with characteristic intensity. The first challenge was selecting an aircraft. The bomber needed sufficient range to fly from the carrier to Japan and then to China, approximately 2,000 miles total. It needed to be small enough to operate from a carrier deck yet large enough to carry a meaningful bomb load. After evaluating options, Doolittle selected the North American B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engine medium bomber. The B-25 had never operated from a carrier. At 56 feet long with a 67-foot wingspan, it was far larger than any carrier aircraft. Takeoff would require perfect timing and technique. Landing back on the carrier was impossible. The B-25 was too large and lacked a tail hook. The mission would be one way to China. 24 B-25B bombers were modified for the mission. Engineers stripped out unnecessary equipment to reduce weight. The lower gun turret was removed and replaced with a painted broomstick to deceive enemy fighters. Additional fuel tanks were installed in every available space, including crawl spaces and the bomb bay, increasing fuel capacity from 646 gallons to 1,141 gallons. This extended range came at a cost. The extra fuel tanks in the bomb bay reduced bomb capacity from 3,000 pounds to 2,000 pounds. Crews received specialized training at Eglin Field in Florida and later at Alameda Naval Air Station in California. They practiced short-field takeoffs, simulating carrier deck launches. The B-25 normally required 1,200 feet of runway. They had to get airborne in under 500 feet with a heavy load. Pilots practiced again and again, learning to release brakes at precisely the right moment, apply full throttle, and rotate at the minimum safe speed. Navigation training emphasized low-level flight and dead reckoning. They would approach Japan at wave-top height to avoid radar detection. Security was absolute. Crews knew only that they were training for an extremely hazardous mission. Not until they were at sea did Doolittle brief them fully. The target was Tokyo. They would bomb the Japanese capital and other cities in daylight, then fly to China. The risks were obvious. The mission was voluntary. Every man volunteered to continue. Coordination with China presented enormous challenges. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, fighting for survival against Japanese invasion, was initially reluctant to allow American bombers to land in eastern China, fearing Japanese retaliation. Eventually, he agreed. 5 airfields in Zhejiang province would be prepared to receive the raiders. Radio homing beacons would guide them in. It was hoped that friendly Chinese forces would protect and evacuate the crews. The reality was far more uncertain than planners acknowledged. Communications with Chinese forces were unreliable. Japanese forces controlled much of eastern China. The airfields were primitive, lacking modern navigation equipment. Weather over China was unpredictable, but there were no alternatives. The crews would launch, bomb Japan, and head for China. What happened after that was uncertain. On April 2, 1942, USS Hornet departed San Francisco Bay with 16 B-25s lashed to her flight deck, an unprecedented sight that turned heads along the waterfront. The carrier rendezvoused with Admiral Halsey's flagship USS Enterprise and her escorts on April 13, forming Task Force 16. Enterprise carried the fighter protection. Her aircraft would defend both carriers. Hornet's deck was occupied by the B-25s. She could not launch or recover her own aircraft until the Army bombers departed. The task force steamed westward at high speed, maintaining strict radio silence. Success depended on reaching the launch point undetected. Japanese picket boats, small patrol vessels stationed hundreds of miles from the home islands, were the primary threat to surprise. If spotted too far from Japan, the task force would have to abort or launch from extreme range, reducing chances of reaching China. Aboard Hornet, crews made final preparations. They loaded 4 500-pound bombs per aircraft, 3 high-explosive and 1 bundle of incendiaries. Doolittle's crew loaded special munitions, friendship medals, Japanese decorations American officers had received before the war, attached to bombs as a symbolic gesture. Crews painted nose art, wrote letters home, and tried to rest despite knowing what lay ahead. The plan called for a night launch on April 19 from 400 miles offshore, allowing the bombers to strike at dawn and reach China before dark. But at 7:38 hours on April 18, the task force encountered the Japanese picket boat Nidomaru. Enterprise's cruisers immediately opened fire, sinking the vessel, but the Japanese boat had transmitted a warning before being destroyed. The element of surprise was lost. Admiral Halsey faced an instant decision: abort and turn back, continue to the planned launch point and risk the task force being attacked by Japanese bombers, or launch immediately, 10 hours early and 200 miles farther from Japan than planned. Launching early meant the B-25s would arrive over Japan in daylight rather than dawn, increasing danger from fighters and anti-aircraft fire. More critically, it reduced fuel margins for reaching China by perhaps 10%, a slim margin that might mean the difference between landing safely and crashing. Halsey ordered immediate launch. The mission would proceed. At 8:20 hours, Doolittle's B-25 began its takeoff roll. The carrier pitched in heavy seas. Doolittle timed his acceleration to the ship's movement, releasing brakes as the bow rose. The B-25 staggered into the air with minimal clearance. 15 more bombers followed, all successfully clearing the deck, a testament to pilot skill and crew training. By 9:24 hours, all 16 bombers were airborne, heading west toward Japan. Doolittle's aircraft approached the Japanese coast just after noon. Flying at wave-top height to avoid detection, the bombers hugged the water until they reached landfall, then climbed to bombing altitude, 500 feet, low enough for accuracy but high enough to clear obstacles. The sight that greeted them was surreal. Japan appeared completely unprepared. No fighters rose to intercept. Anti-aircraft fire was sparse and inaccurate. Civilians and soldiers looked up in shock as American bombers roared overhead. Doolittle's target was Tokyo. His bombardier released 4 bombs on an industrial area, then the B-25 turned southwest, heading for China. Behind Doolittle, crew after crew reached their assigned targets and dropped their bombs. Tokyo was hit by the majority of aircraft. Other bombers struck Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe, Japan's major industrial centers. The physical damage was limited. 16 bombers carrying 4 500-pound bombs each could not inflict serious destruction on a modern city. An estimated 50 people were killed, several hundred injured. Some factories, military facilities, and residential areas were damaged. Oil storage tanks burned. But in strategic terms, the material impact was negligible, far less than a single night of firebombing later in the war would inflict. But the psychological impact was enormous. Japan's military leadership had assured the population that the home islands were invulnerable to attack. Defensive forces existed to protect conquered territories, not to defend Japan itself. The idea that American bombers could appear over Tokyo in broad daylight, bomb the capital, and escape was inconceivable. Yet it had happened. Japanese interceptors finally scrambled but arrived too late. The B-25s were already heading out to sea. Anti-aircraft fire increased but remained ineffective. 1 bomber was slightly damaged. All 16 aircraft escaped Japanese airspace and headed west across the Pacific toward China, 1,200 miles away. The flight to China became a desperate race against fuel exhaustion and darkness. The early launch meant the bombers would reach China after nightfall rather than in daylight. The primitive Chinese airfields lacked runway lights. Navigation would depend on radio homing beacons that might or might not be operating. Weather was deteriorating. A storm system was moving into eastern China. Doolittle's crew navigated by dead reckoning, occasionally glimpsing landmarks through clouds. Fuel gauges steadily dropped. As darkness fell and weather worsened, the situation became critical. The homing beacons were not transmitting, either because the Chinese had not been adequately notified of the early launch, or because equipment failures prevented operation. The crews were flying blind into darkness, storms, and mountainous terrain, with fuel running out. One by one, crews faced the same terrible realization. They would not reach the airfields. Some aircraft ran completely out of fuel. Others, with engines sputtering, chose to crash land or bail out rather than attempt landing in darkness on unfamiliar terrain. Of the 16 bombers, 15 crews bilaid out or crash-landed in China. One aircraft diverted to Vladivostok in Soviet territory, where the crew was interned. The Soviets were not at war with Japan and could not allow obvious violation of neutrality, though they treated the crew well and eventually facilitated their escape. Doolittle's crew bilaid out in darkness over mountainous terrain in eastern China. Doolittle parachuted into a rice paddy, bruised but alive. His crew scattered across several miles, each man landing safely. Through the night, Chinese civilians and friendly troops found the scattered airmen. Similar scenes played out across eastern China as Chinese villagers and soldiers located American flyers, sometimes just ahead of Japanese patrols. The casualties were sobering. Of 80 men who launched from Hornet, 71 eventually returned to American control. 3 were killed in crash landings or bailout accidents. 8 were captured by Japanese forces. The fate of the captured men was particularly tragic. They were tortured, subjected to show trials, and 3 were executed. 1 died of malnutrition in captivity. 4 survived harsh imprisonment and were liberated in 1945. Chinese civilians who aided the raiders paid a terrible price. Japanese forces, enraged by the raid and the assistance locals provided to the American airmen, launched brutal reprisals. The Zhejiangjiangxi campaign in summer 1942 was explicitly designed to punish Chinese populations and destroy the airfields. An estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed in retaliation, a horrific toll for assisting the Doolittle raiders. The Doolittle Raid's immediate material impact was minimal. 16 bombers dropping 64 bombs could not significantly damage Japan's industrial capacity. The attack barely scratched Japan's war machine. By strict military accounting, the raid cost 16 precious B-25 bombers, sacrificed for negligible physical results. But warfare is never purely material. The psychological and strategic impacts were profound and far-reaching. In America, news of the raid sparked celebration. After months of defeats and retreating forces, Americans had struck back at the heart of the Japanese Empire. Newspapers trumpeted the attack. Morale soared. The raid demonstrated that Japan was not invincible, that American forces could reach the enemy homeland, that the war could be won. When reporters asked Roosevelt where the bombers had come from, he replied with a smile, "Shangri-La, the fictional Himalayan paradise from the popular novel Lost Horizon." The answer was obviously evasive but captured public imagination. The exact details remained classified, but Americans knew their forces had bombed Tokyo. That knowledge was enough. For Japan, the raid was a profound shock. The military leadership had confidently assured Emperor Hirohito that the homeland was safe from attack. Yet American bombers had appeared over Tokyo in daylight, bombed the capital while the emperor was in residence, and escaped. The embarrassment was immense. The psychological wound ran deep. Japanese military planners drew critical strategic conclusions from the raid. The attack demonstrated that American carriers could approach Japan and launch strikes. The homeland was vulnerable. Japan's defensive perimeter needed to be pushed farther east, beyond carrier striking range. Naval forces must locate and destroy the American carriers before they could threaten Japan again. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, advocated an aggressive response. He proposed an operation to seize Midway Island, the westernmost American outpost in the Pacific. Capturing Midway would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and, more importantly, would force the U.S. Pacific Fleet to respond. In the decisive battle that would surely follow, Japanese naval power would destroy the American carriers. The Japanese leadership approved Yamamoto's plan. The Doolittle Raid had been the catalyst. Less than 2 months later, in June 1942, the Battle of Midway would be fought. Instead of the decisive Japanese victory Yamamoto envisioned, Midway became a catastrophic defeat. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, the cream of naval aviation destroyed, the initiative in the Pacific permanently lost to America. The connection between the Doolittle Raid and Midway is direct and clear. Without the raid's psychological shock, Japanese planners might not have felt compelled to expand operations so aggressively. Without the urgency to push the defensive perimeter eastward and destroy the American carriers, the Midway operation might not have been approved or might have been planned more carefully. The 16 bombers that launched from Hornet on April 18 set in motion events that culminated in the turning point of the Pacific War. Behind the strategic analysis and historical significance stand the 80 men who flew the mission. They were volunteers who understood the risks. The mission was described as extremely hazardous, with no guarantee of survival, yet every selected crew member chose to go. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle believed the raid was a failure. After bailing out over China and gathering his crew, his first thought was that he had lost all 16 aircraft and would likely face court-martial. He believed his military career was over. In reality, he received the Medal of Honor, was promoted 2 grades to Brigadier General, and went on to command air forces in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. He became one of America's most celebrated military aviators, but he never forgot the men lost on the raid or the Chinese civilians who suffered in retaliation. Captain Ted Lawson, pilot of aircraft number 7, crash-landed on the Chinese coast. He suffered severe injuries, including the loss of a leg. His book, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, later adapted into a popular film, brought the raid to life for millions of Americans. The title captured the experience. After months of planning and training, after the tense carrier approach, after the launch and long flight to Japan, the actual bombing run lasted just 30 seconds. Lieutenant Robert Hite was one of 8 raiders captured by Japanese forces. He endured 40 months of brutal captivity, torture, starvation, and psychological abuse. He survived to witness Japan's surrender and returned home to rebuild his life. His story, and those of the other 3 survivors of Japanese captivity, testified to extraordinary resilience and courage. The Chinese civilians and soldiers who aided the raiders demonstrated remarkable courage. They risked Japanese retaliation to hide American airmen, guide them to safety, and evacuate them through territory partially controlled by enemy forces. Many paid with their lives. Father John Birch, a missionary who helped rescue raiders, later worked with American intelligence and was killed by Chinese Communist forces in 1945. Some consider him the first casualty of the Cold War. The Doolittle Raid entered American legend as a symbol of courage, ingenuity, and determination. It demonstrated that even in the darkest hours, bold action was possible. It showed that unconventional thinking and inter-service cooperation could achieve the seemingly impossible. It proved that the American spirit was unbroken despite Pearl Harbor and the disasters that followed. The raid's survivors formed a close-knit group, reuniting annually for decades. They shared a bond forged in shared danger and shared purpose. At each reunion, they performed a ritual, opening bottles of cognac from 1896, Doolittle's birth year. The bottles were stored in a special case with silver goblets engraved with each raider's name. When a raider died, his goblet was turned upside down. As the years passed, more and more goblets were inverted. The final public reunion occurred in 2013 at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Only 4 raiders remained alive. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, was among them. He participated in the final goblet ceremony, honoring the 76 raiders who had passed. Cole himself died in 2019 at age 103, the last survivor of the 80 men who flew the mission. The Doolittle Raid's place in military history is secure. It demonstrated that bold leadership, careful planning, intensive training, and courage could accomplish missions that seemed impossible. It proved that psychological warfare, striking at enemy morale and forcing strategic miscalculation, could be as important as material destruction. It showed that even symbolic victories matter when morale hangs in the balance. Modern military professionals study the raid as an example of joint operations, special mission planning, and strategic risk-taking. The coordination between Army and Navy, the innovative use of carriers as launching platforms for land-based bombers, the meticulous attention to detail in preparation, all remain relevant lessons. So too is the darker lesson, that civilians often pay the price for military operations, as the Chinese victims of Japanese retaliation tragically demonstrated. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers accomplished what military analysts had declared impossible. They launched from a carrier deck, bombed Japan's major cities, and most of their crews survived. The material damage was minimal: a few factories damaged, some fires, dozens of casualties. By conventional measures, the raid barely registered. But warfare is never purely about material calculations. The Doolittle Raid inflicted a psychological wound on Japan that never healed. It demonstrated American resolve and capability. It forced Japanese strategic miscalculation that led to Midway. It boosted American morale at a critical moment. It proved that audacity and courage could achieve the impossible. The 80 men who flew the mission understood the risks. 8 paid with their freedom and 3 with their lives. But their courage, and the courage of Jimmy Doolittle who led them, delivered exactly what America needed in April 1942: a victory, a symbol, a proof that the war could be won. The raid lasted just minutes. The bombs fell for 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds reverberated across the Pacific, through the course of the war and into history. When Americans needed heroes, Doolittle's raiders delivered. When the nation needed hope, they provided it. When military analysts said something was impossible, they did it anyway. That is why, more than 80 years later, the Doolittle Raid remains one of the most celebrated missions in American military history. Not for the damage inflicted, but for the courage displayed, the ingenuity demonstrated, and the message delivered. America was in this war to win, no matter the odds, no matter the cost, no matter what conventional wisdom said was possible. 16 bombers against an empire. 80 men who volunteered for a mission with no guarantee of return. 30 seconds over Tokyo that changed the course of the Pacific War. That is the legacy of the Doolittle Raid.